All right. Good afternoon. So we're about 1/5 in, right? 1/5 exams. Haven't finished grading it yet, but hopefully next time I'll see you. I should have it back.
How are they so far?
Can't quite tell yet because I usually grade sort of by the question and then have to add it all up. So I don't know how they go over. So I go horizontally, not vertically. So if that makes sense. I think what I've seen so far is all right. All right. So the second part, so the first part of this course, we've been looking just at how the idea of self-determination is used in at least 3 different ways when we're talking about international issues, right? We've seen some different ideas about how self-determination, how the idea might make sense, where it takes hold, if you will, so like at the level of individuals, at the level of collectives, or maybe some combination of the two. And we've seen some foreshadowing already of the implications that it will have, right? So Tesson and Walter and a couple of hints we've seen in Altman and Wellman also, people talking about intervention and so on. So that's where we'll be going. But one of the implications that it has usually, and it has to do with democracy, how democratic a society is, and whether a society is thought to be self-determining often is thought to be a matter of whether they are democratic or not. And so this part of the course or term, we're going to be looking at that relation in particular, and a little bit at how, well, whatever. By doing that, we'll get a closer idea also about what the theory of self-determination, bless you, what it's supposed to be getting at. So it's in some ways an extension of the first part, but also a new topic. So I asked you to read for today and next week, bless you.
Bless you.
Rousseau's Social Contract. By far the most difficult text we'll read this term. No. We'll take it, because it's a difficult text, we'll take it slowly. I'll spend 2 days on this, and basically we'll just be trying to pull apart all the different threads and elements of the story, of the argument that Rousseau is presenting. But we'll get there, so if you feel confused, then that's all right. It's confusing. But it will be, it's a deep theory, and it will help us a lot, I think, as we go along. It's a very interesting theory at the same time. Now, Rousseau drives a lot of people crazy when they read him. You'll see he's a very flamboyant author. So he's an excellent writer. Like the prose is beautiful, right? Like it's not dry or anything, and it's not overly technical, and you don't have to deal with math-looking formulas and stuff, right? So he's very stimulating in that way. But at the same time, he'll say things that seem sort of, at least at first glance, it seem crazy, right? He'll say things that look like straight-up contradictions. He flirts with paradox all the time, right? He'll say these things like, we'll get back to this, but like man is born in chains and free, yet everywhere is in chains, right? So like how people will be forced to be free, that seems just an oxymoron, right? And so these kinds of things he's doing all the time, and that irritates people. It irritates me sometimes. You think like, why don't you just say what you mean and be clear about it instead of throwing these supposed riddles at me and then I have to work my way through. But there's a lot of meat on the bone here, and so that's what we're going to be trying to do. It's a classic, right? Like you've heard of the social contract. You've heard of Rousseau, I'm sure. Right. In the social contract tradition, in some ways, Rousseau is sort of the most social contractist of them all. So what I mean by that is if you want to look at what the idea is that this whole tradition of the social contract is sort of organized around, in some ways you get one of the sort of the purest or most extreme forms of it in Rousseau. So he's been very influential in that. He had a big influence on Kant, for example. If you ever go and read Kant, you'll see his political thought. You see Rousseau all over the place. He had a major influence on Hegel. You'll see Rousseau holds some version of what Tesson calls the Hegelian myth. And he has an argument for it. And he's had a lot of influence on 20th century theorists. Lots of theorists these days, philosophers who take themselves to be big defenders of democracy, take themselves to be in some way or form a follower of Rousseau. If you've ever heard of John Rawls, for example, in many ways John Rawls' theory takes up and tries to make more coherent or clear ideas that were already present in Rousseau. So, all right, that's just, hopefully, that's my halftime inspirational talk. Right? Come on, get them. All right. So remember, right? So what we're doing is we're still looking at self-determination, but we're going to be taking a step back now. These two classes, right? Like Rousseau doesn't talk much about international affairs. He doesn't talk much. I don't think he uses the word self-determination at all. But there is a theory of self-determination in there, and all the theories of democracy may look back to Rousseau, but definitely almost all the theories of self-determination in some way are indebted to what Rousseau is doing. So he's really the first thinker who comes up with this idea of self-determination, of a society or a collective as having a right to order its own affairs. That's how Altman and Wellman put it, right? Or as Hegel put it later, society or a collective having its own will. You'll see that Rousseau takes that very seriously. He calls it the general will. But where Altman and Wellman, we will see, we haven't yet, but we'll see, we've talked about it a little bit before, think self-determination can happen without democracy, and we have already seen that Walzer thinks that. That's not true for Rousseau, so they are distancing themselves from Rousseau in that sense. For Rousseau, democracy is going to be crucial. That's the whole story about self-determination for him. And he has a very extreme form of democracy in mind, by the way. Just so you know, like for Rousseau, society is like we don't live in a democracy for Rousseau. What he means by democracy is not us. We live in a representative democracy, right? So there's an election, you go, you tick off a box, and then all that gets added up in some complicated way, and then someone is appointed who then starts making the rules, right? So who's representing us? At least that's the theory. For Rousseau, that won't do. For Rousseau, a democracy really is it's like sort of the Athenian case, right? So like remember, like in Athenian democracies, you had all the citizens would come together on the main square and vote and deliberate on the issues of the day, and that's really what he wants. And he wants that really to be so that even in an extreme form where everyone has a veto. Right? So if you don't, like everyone has a vote, and the only laws that get accepted are the ones that everyone can accept. Wow. So that's a very extreme form of democracy that he has in mind. Anyway, we'll get to that. All right. Let's start with some reading of Rousseau together, just so we get a little bit sink our teeth into the prose a little. I asked you to think about this, right? Here's how he starts. Man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. Your first paradox. First sentence, first paradox, right? One thinks himself the master of others and still remains a greater slave than they. Second sentence, second paradox, right? You think you're the master and you're bigger, so there's a slave and then there's the master, and for Rousseau somehow the master is even greater slave than the slave, right? It's not the story you're usually told, so anyway. How did this change come about? I don't know. He says, but what can make it legitimate? That's a question I can. So he's going to say, something happens between when we were born and where we are now. And he thinks there's a change, right, that happens between those periods of time. And that change can be made legitimate, he thinks. What can make it legitimate? I guess he thinks it's not always legitimate, right? And we'll see, you will have seen that in the first book. He starts going after Grotius, for example. He thinks Grotius has this idiotic theory, like thinks of a society as just a collection of slaves, all subdued to the king, who's the one slave master. Who then is somehow a greater slave, but anyway. So that's an illegitimate society, right? That's just subjugation. But apparently, even though something like that is still happening to us, it can also still be legitimate. And that's the story in the social contract, right? That's a theory. He's going to tell you, here is how living in chains can be, having a master, can be legitimate, something like that. All right, back up. Man is born free and everywhere is in chains. What is he talking about? What do you think that sentence means? Like, what is he talking? Like, What the heck, right? Chantal?
Start off with I took it as that we're born free, but things like societal rules or society as a whole are changed because, for example, this extreme case, you can't just go and murder someone.
Right.
You know, so society and our rules and our governments will manage to change.
Good. So like we're born free, but when we live in a society as adults, then we are restricted in various ways. So you said like you can't just go murder someone. That's probably a good one, right? But there are a whole bunch of them. Right? Is that what you had in mind, Chi?
Yeah, that's good.
Anthony?
It is, yeah, something similar, like you're born in the nation, like without any real like social responsibilities or anything, like, but then you go into society, people put expectations on you, and they force you to become things that if you end up doing something else, then you just consider like an outsider or something.
Good. Yeah, so that's interesting, right? So that's the question of like, well, how is a baby born free, right? And maybe it's not capable of much, right? It's a baby, and so how is it free? But maybe there's a similar sense in like when we just think back of in time or something, right? Like when mankind, like humankind, right, was originally there, then first they were free, but then they've changed into these societies that you're talking about that have all these restrictions. And so we're not just free to do whatever we want anymore. And that's the change that he's talking about, right? Chantal?
And I also see it as just like what you say about the baby being born free. The baby doesn't know anything. But as we get older and go through things, we gain more knowledge. And sometimes knowledge itself is a change because you know bad things or you know things that just kind of set you back or maybe something you don't want to know. So kind of, anyways, knowledge could be a change.
Do you have an example in mind for how knowledge might be a chain? Or IDs might be a chain or something?
I guess if you're a child and you have a sibling, you know that you're not supposed to hit them. So, but if they do something that makes you upset, you're kind of like, oh man, I can't hit them because it's
Right.
bad thing to do, but you know.
So far, so good. Yeah, go on.
I don't know,
All right. Well, I mean, I was asking you about it because I think Rousseau. I mean, it's a point that Rousseau cares about. How IDs or expectations, things that happen in our minds, can be limiting and can be restricting. You know. So actually, this has to do with why he thinks that the master is actually, a person who actually has slaves, bosses people around, something like that, is a greater slave than they. Has to do with that. I mean, so. Here's an example that you might have, we'll get back to this later, but here's an example that might just make it vivid. Like for the longest time, women were told that their place was in the kitchen, right? Like they were supposed to be homemakers, not pursue a career or something. Of course, there were plenty of women who said, screw it, I'm doing whatever the hell, like Marie Curie didn't really care, right? She just went and invented things, discovered things. But many other women did, right? And so there was an idea that they were raised with about what their proper place in society or in life would be, and they kept to that, and that's a limiting thing. Now, Rousseau, you might think about what some people at the time maybe they thought that was the right idea, but probably not, right? And so removing that idea from us in that sense is a liberating thing. Right? Or here's a slightly different one. Here's the example that many of Rousseau's followers will give you. Rousseau himself and the followers of Rousseau also usually are very critical of sort of commercial or capitalistic societies. So think about like keeping up with the Joneses, right? Like so the neighbors have a beautiful new car, so now I need to spend money on getting a good car too, or something like that. Usually goes a little more subtle than that, but that's a rough idea, right? Can't fall behind. So when you're moved by that, that's an idea that's not really the right kind of idea or desire, like temptation maybe to be moved by. You should be spending your money on the things that truly matter to you, not just on sort of keeping up appearances. And so That's another way in which you can be restricted, right, by an ID. And so Rousseau thinks actually that the slave master who's bossing people around, he's treating other people in a way that's inferior, and that's being moved not by the sort of the nobler, better parts of ourselves. That's moved by some type of desire to get status, something to be high up in the hierarchy. And so that's a bad motivation, and that's why the slave master is a greater slave, because he's a slave to that sentiment. Right? That's his idea. Now, in a democracy, he thinks none of that will happen, because there are no slaves, and a democracy really captures our equality, and so in a democracy, since we're all going to be equal, he thinks, there is no room for that type of desire to really find its expression, and so you're liberated from it. That's the theory. Right? So there's a lot of stuff that comes later in the books that he is jam-packing in these first two sentences here. Right? Anyway, we'll get to the details as we move along, but that's what he's foreshadowing, and he's saying here, like, well, historically there's something happened that made us become people who want to keep up with the Joneses. Why? Well, I don't know. You have to ask a psychologist, right? That's not me. I'm a philosopher. But I can tell you what are the conditions under which we can have chains and restrictions, but that still be legitimate. And he thinks it has to be different from a slave type relationship. Right? It has to be equal. It's ultimately what he cares about. And so democracy is going to play that role for him. So far, so good? It's by way of foreshadowing, right? All right, here's another one. So, quote, right? The problem is to find a form of association which will defend and protect with the whole common force the person and goods of each associate, and in which, while uniting himself with all, while uniting himself with all, may still obey himself alone and remain as free as before. This is the fundamental problem to it. So I asked you about this, right? Like, what's he doing here? Jay?
I guess he's referring to individuals need a society or a political institution that will take care of their rights and make sure that they're not violated, while also allowing that individual to have free will and to be able to do what they want in that society, but not necessarily like everything that they want. That's where the change come in. But
sure, yeah, good.
And not just killing.
Yeah, good. Yeah, it's a very nice summary. So the idea is something like, correct me if I'm missing part of it, you said like several parts to it. Like, the idea is that the fundamental problem is how can we have a society in which we live together and therefore because we live in a society, we don't live in anarchy, right? It's not just free, do whatever you want. There are going to be limits, like the limit on murder that Chanel's done, right? But at the same time, even though there are those limits, you do have this sense of what you call free will, but basically the idea that you get to live as you want. And these chains are not just, it's not like the slave master who tells you you don't get to do this and this and this with your life, you get to work on the cotton fields, right? So that's not what this, so political society does have chains, but these chains somehow don't impede your freedom. Right? And so that's the paradoxical part again, right? So you're supposed to be in chains and free at the same time. And the theory is supposed to give you an answer for how that's possible, how the chains of society, how the rules, the laws of society might actually not just be consistent with your freedom, Rousseau thinks, but actually positively give you your freedom. Rousseau thinks when it really comes down to it, that kind of freedom it's not just the one thing that a democracy can give you. Democracy is the only thing that can give you that. So in an anarchy, he thinks, you wouldn't be that free. You would still be under threat of other people killing you. You might be subject to these bad desires that democracy will somehow cure. We'll see how. But a democracy, you're safe, your rights are secure, and you're still free. Sorry?
Your property is secured.
Yeah, good. Yeah, your property will be secured, but that would be a form of rights for him, right? Like so. Now, let me see. All right. So anyway, just to foreshadow, I think coming back to this in one of the next slides. When we say your rights will be secure, Rousseau means something very different from that than, for example, well, most of you probably have in mind, right? making an assumption, but like so the standard American tradition has been to think of our rights as these God-given rights, right? Natural rights, right? Self-evident, as the Declaration puts it. Right? So the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? These are God-given rights, and they're inalienable rights, meaning they're yours, and the government can't take them away from you. That's, I'm going to just say for the second, like, as Americans, that's what we believe. Right? All you believe that. Rousseau says, wrong. You're all wrong. No. You'll see, if you've seen, he says in the social contract that each associate, so each individual person, citizen, has to, the first thing you have to do when forming a society that's going to be free and self-determining and following the social contract, first thing you do is you surrender all of your rights. Everything. You lay them down, including your property, including your right to liberty, pursuit of happiness, your life, everything. Nothing gets kept. Right? So the American idea is, so I set up a society, protect my rights, but I keep my rights. Right? Like the rights are mine, and I create a society. That's John Locke's idea, really, fundamentally. Individual people have their rights, and then we create this government, and the job of the government is to, those rights that were mine, and they're still mine, and I'm not giving them up, right? Your job, government, is to protect those rights. Better than I could do it by myself in an anarchy situation. Right? No, says Rousseau. All of them go first, you give everything up, but then what you get in return from this society and from the government and the law is a better version. You get rights in return as well. First you give up all your rights, but then the law are going to assign you rights, give you rights. This is your right to life, this is your right to liberty, this is your right to property, and so on. But that's a better version, he thinks. So that's the truly free version. That's like hugely controversial, right? What he's saying. Like you retain no rights whatsoever against society. Whatever the law tells you your rights are, that's it. You have no complaint. There's no ground, there's no standard to which you can appeal. Right? You might say, well, but God, no, the law, right? Yeah, but my philosophy, no, the law, right? The Bible, no, the law, right? Whatever I had a dream, no, right? Every possible answer you might give doesn't fly. And then yet somehow, right, we're back into the paradox land, somehow total freedom and happiness and independence and autonomy, whatever you will, it's going your way if you do this. There is the promised land, and it'll be freer than you could be even if there were no government existed whatsoever. Any questions so far? Except for how the hell does this make sense? But yeah, Shane.
So his rights are different from our rights, I guess? Like, from what the government gives you?
What do you mean? His right? Can you explain what you mean?
By that, I mean, like, when a society is created and then you exchange all your rights for protection and assigned rights that they give you. So, like, I don't know. Oh, yeah. Would their rights be different from the rights from
Who's they? Their rights? Like whose rights?
A society that's created, I guess, that's different from America.
So, like we're imagining Rousseau's dream society?
Yeah,
is that it?
Rousseau's dream, yeah.
Right. So he seems to suggest in the preface, like he was from Geneva. That was sort of at the time he thought the closest it got, right? So let's say, like, imagine Geneva as like a city-state. Let's say Geneva is fully Rousseau style, right? And so your question is, like, do they actually have different rights than you and I do? That's the question? Like today, you mean? Right. Yeah, it's going to depend, right? So it's going to be a democracy, and the democracy is going to decide what the rights are. And so, yeah, who knows what this democracy will come up with?
Like an extreme democracy where, like, every that the law that they create has to fit with every single person, and if like one person doesn't agree, then they don't go with it. Yeah, that's at least the purest form of Rousseau's argument. Yeah. It sounds like impossible. If that makes sense. Like it'll take a while before. Yeah, Rousseau has an argument for why he thinks it's not what do you mean by impossible? Like we're never going to agree on anything?
Yeah,
right.
Like they're never going to get there.
So he thinks actually democracy will have some type of educational or like cleansing effect, so that we, by having to go through the democratic negotiations and discussions, we will, that will educate us in some way, so that we will come better and therefore together. We'll get to that probably next week, but yeah, that is, I mean, that's a worry, right? And so followers from Rousseau, I'll get to you in a second, Chantal. So followers from Rousseau they don't defend this unanimity direct voting rule, right? Because they agree with you. They say you're never going to get a single law passed, right? Maybe the law against murder, but then if we have to start talking about like, well, with intent, without intent, manslaughter, like, maybe not even the law against murder we can get passed, right? If we really get down to the nitty-gritty. So they say, well, okay, we don't have the time anyway, right? So the followers of Rousseau want to defend something like the system that we have, in which we would appoint representatives who would do that for it. And the trick for that type of theory is, can you still claim all the benefits that Rousseau claims for democracy if it's unanimity and direct voting? Can you still claim those for a society like ours? Because they're hefty benefits, right? Like it's perfect freedom and so, right? Chantal? It's Chantal, right? I'm saying it right? Chantal? Right.
I don't see, but is there anywhere where people increase the kind of society on a large scale or small scale?
Yeah, great question. So like you'd think presumably the bigger the society, the more difficult this is going to get, right?
I think it would be hard, but for a smaller society, it's a little more possible. But
Right.
You have millions or billions. How is that?
Yeah, the dirty, like, I compared it to Athenian democracy right now, and you might say, well, that worked. Of course, the dirty secret about Athenian democracy is that citizens all had the vote, but not everybody there was a citizen, by like only a very small part of the society. Like there were slaves, women didn't have, then there were unpropertied men, like all those didn't get so it was just a really small part of society. They got the vote, right? So that's not a Rousseau type democracy either, right? So even if Athens might have turned out to be too big and unwieldy, maybe. Of course, smaller, it's not always just smaller, right? But think about it, like Rwanda was a really small country, is a really small country, but it's so racially divided, ethnically divided between Hutus and Tutsi that maybe they won't get a lot, even that small, but still wouldn't work, right? So yeah, it might be, now, again, Rousseau claims that these type of divisions will be sorted out by the democratic process, but many people who defend something like a representative democracy defend it because they think once numbers get too big, you just can't get this off the ground anymore. It's just not doable. Even if, and that might be true, even if Rousseau's, the benefits that he claims for democratic deliberation are true, right? You might think just if there's too many people, there won't be enough time for everyone to go through the steps and the deliberations, that like you just can't handle it. And then we're back to the question that we were talking about, like if we're going to have a different system, will that different system still work the way that he, even assuming his argument works, right? All right. All right? So, basically the bottom line is this, right? Like he wants to know what makes it a community of rights, so a legitimate one. It's the same theme topic that we've seen with Altman and Wellman, front and center, right? And not one of might, not just merely of force. Of course, we all live in political societies of some kind, but most of these Rousseau things are illegitimate because they're not ones that follow his theory. So they're ones that are kept together by force. And he chides Grotius for defending just that. All right. So, what I said earlier, Rousseau says you'll be secure in this society in all your rights. Right? And to get that, we first need to give them all up, and then you get them in return, you get the better form, which is given to you by the society. So, here is this. His description of why that is. Read it together. There's a point to this. So why do we have to give it up? Right, so, okay, the clauses of this contract, that's the social contract, right? That's the terms on which a society is going to be created, organized. Properly understood may be reduced to one. He says, really, there's one thing that matters. That's the bottom line here. It's like the total alienation of each associate together with all his rights to the whole community. So you as a person and all your rights, your property, your freedoms, whatever, you have to surrender yourself to the community. Not to a king, not to a slaveholder, that would be force, right, subjugation, but to the community, to the collective of which you are a part. There's your Hegelian thought. For, in the first place, as each gives himself, absolutely, the conditions are the same for all. Absolutely, so without reservation, right? Without holding these type of natural rights, inalienable rights in your back pocket. No, everything. So if everybody gives everything up, absolutely, then everyone has the same conditions, right? So that means there's an idea of equality for him. We're all equally surrendered to the community. And this being so, no one has any interest in making them burdensome to others. He says, well, if everybody has fully surrendered to the community, then nobody in the community would want the terms by which they live, set by the community, to be bad. Right? So that's why you can already see why he thinks what you get back is going to be a pretty good deal. Because whatever terms are going to apply, they're going to apply equally to all, and nobody wants the terms to be bad. So whatever... If I want the terms for me to be good, they have to be good for you as well. And whatever terms you think are good are going to have to be good for me as well, and otherwise I'll veto. Right? So he thinks it's built into the system that you're protected. But that only if I surrender everything in the beginning. If I keep them in my back pocket, right, and I say, like, I actually have a lot of money, and my right to property, my money is actually protected by natural God-given rights, inalienable. Now I have maybe some power to negotiate, right? I say, well, I know you want to tax me, government, but the only way I'll agree to it, I'll sign up to the social contract, is if I get some special privileges, right? For people of my class and so on. And that screws everything up. Now somebody else will have lesser privileges, the equality is out of the window. I might want to oppress people who would come after my money. And so, no, that's what Rousseau is worrying about. That's why he wants this total surrender. So, well, being without reserve, the union is as perfect as it can be. No associate has anything more to demand. For, if individuals retain certain rights, as there would be no common superior to decide between them and the public, each being on one point his own judge would ask to be so on all. The state of nature would thus continue, and the association would necessarily become inoperative and tyrannic. So, the idea here is this. Look, why do we need a government at all? Right? It's the background to what he's saying here. Why do we need a government at all? Well, imagine that we live in anarchy. Right? No government. What would happen? Well, we'd probably end up fighting, right? Maybe I have my little farm and I'm growing my own tomatoes. You come in, you think, delicious tomatoes, I'm hungry, I'll eat some tomatoes. And I think, you're a thief, right? You say, I'm not a thief, I thought they were like, I don't care, thief. And we end up fighting, right? Some version of this. Or maybe you say, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize it. What can I do to make it up? And I say, $5,000. He was one of my prized winning tomatoes. Say, $5,000, which is tomatoes? No, right? Here's $5. Right? 5,005. We'll end up fighting. Right? At some point, maybe you and I get out. We'll figure out a way. $50, both okay. But then the next person comes along. He's not so pliable, right? And then we'll end up fighting. So there's going to be an issue. Who's going to win the fight? Well, the strongest, not the person who's right, necessarily, right? And so that's not legitimate, right? That's not living together as equals. That's not living under justice. That's just straight up war, just in a small version of it. So he thinks that's not what we want. What we want is we want some type of impartial rule or something, right, that we can appeal to. Maybe a judge, maybe the police or something, like something more than just I'm stronger than you. And so he says, well, that's what the social contract gives you as well. Right? Because since we are fully giving ourselves up to the community, we'll put the community in charge. And its rules, its laws. So that union is as perfect as can be, and no associate has anything more to demand. Right? So we don't have anything more to demand than whatever the union, the community gives us. And again, if individuals retain certain rights, like my rights to property, right, then there would be no common superior to decide between them and the public. So now the community comes after my money and says, tax, I'm going to tax you, raise your taxes with 5% to pay for the community's thing. I say, no, you can't do that because I have inalienable rights. Now that's a conflict, right? It's just like the conflict between me and you about the prize-winning tomatoes or not. And the problem was no judge, and so we ended up just fighting. Now I have a conflict with the community, and I say, community says tax goes up for everybody. I say, I have an inalienable right. And same problem, right? Like, so who's going to decide? Well, the strongest is going to be the community that wins, so I get screwed. Or maybe I'm so strong that I can buy politicians or something, or I can just fight them off with my guns or whatever. But it's going to be a fight, right? So he says, if to avoid that, anytime people think they have a right they can claim against the community, they are creating the same problem that you had in the state of nature. That problem the community was supposed to solve. And it can only solve it if nobody has any rights anymore. So that's why you have to completely give you up. That's why this union has to be perfect, where we're all equally merged into the collective. That's why the collective has more rights than the individual for Rousseau. Yeah, Chantal.
I know this is his form of democracy, but to me, it sounds more like socialism. So what's the difference between this and socialism?
What's the difference between this and socialism? It's a natural line that you're drawing. Skimming over all sorts of subtleties, distinctions, differences, and so on. There is a natural line to draw from Rousseau to Kant to Hegel to Marx. It's a one in method, about the dialectic method, but it's also one in terms of just the theory itself. And it's definitely true that Rousseau was hostile to many of the ideas that defenders of the free market, or just any type of market really, or capitalistic type society would have, like ideas that Locke held about rights to property, inalienable freedom, and so on. Now that said, there's no necessary link, right? So these are very closely related, and many people, almost everybody who likes Rousseau also dislikes capitalism. It's not necessarily true. I'm sure there are exceptions, but many of them do. And the ideas are closely related. And many people who like capitalism dislike Rousseau, right? and so on. Again, there's no necessary. It's not necessary to do that, right? But it's just natural. But my point is, why is it not necessary? In principle, the society could come together and democratically decide to just create a very capitalistic society. But you'd have to know that it's always going to be that the society is going to be that way, capitalistic, only as long as the community as a whole wants to support it that way. If at some point the community as a whole decides it wants to go in a different direction, then that's the direction it will go. Even if you as an individual, you might want to think that you have inalienable rights to your property, and that the community as a whole, when it is taking things in a different direction, is violating that. You'd be wrong, says Rousseau, right? Because you don't have those rights. You've given them up when you entered society. So, did I get to what you were asking? Okay. All right. So, as we move on, I'm going to try and pull these ideas apart, right? I'm going to give you arguments where I'm step by step trying to lay out with a zoom. I'm trying to. This is a key passage in the social contract, so I want to tell you the ideas that are buried in here. Right? So, this is more or less, don't worry too much, it'll be fine, right? Passage like, everyone has the same terms, so no one has an interest in the terms being bad, and so we'll all live under good terms. Second passage here is saying, actually, alienating all your rights, giving up all your rights, is absolutely necessary, because otherwise we recreate the problem of the state of nature. It's a pretty deep philosophical argument, actually, right? The government is supposed to be the thing that ends the state of nature, and if you keep rights in your back pocket, right, like if you think you don't have to alienate everything, then when there is a conflict between what the community wants to do and those rights, you've recreated the problem of the state of nature, and so we're back to square one. So he thinks the only thing that can really truly count as a political society is going to be a place where all rights and personality and stuff is totally surrendered to the community. This is part of why he thinks only his kind of democracy can do the trick of making you free. All right. So finally, each man, in giving himself to all, gives himself to nobody, and there is no associate over whom he does not acquire the same right as he yields others over himself. He gains an equivalent for everything he loses, and an increase of force for the preservation of what he has. Again, paradoxical, right? In giving himself to all, he gives himself to nobody. Right? So he thinks by totally surrendering and having them totally surrender to you, and everyone is totally surrendering to everybody, there are no masters left. Right? So the only way you can eliminate bosses, he thinks, is by everybody becoming an employee. So to speak. Then there's nothing. So then there is no one. There's no boss. There's no one who can boss you around anymore. No one who dictates terms to you. And that's ultimately what he thinks freedom is about. So, if then we discard from the social compact what is not of its essence, we shall find that it reduces to the following. So if we just strip away all the extra stuff, the real heart of it is puts his person and all power in common under the supreme direction of the general will. Self-determination thought. We receive each member as an indivisible part. So the whole gets formed, and each of us is an indivisible part of the whole. And that's where our rights, that's where our moral powers, our freedoms, everything that we are, ethically speaking, comes from the community to us, not the other way around. So that's as Hegelian as you're going to get it, I guess. At least this term. All right. So, let's take it easy. We'll take it step by step. Try and hopefully clear up what's going on here. So once we show something counterintuitive, we can be truly free, but only if we live in a state. And not just a state, but a state in which we give up all of our freedoms first to the state. Right? Where we accept that the law is final on everything. Right? No such thing as Martin Luther King in Rousseau's world. Right? Martin Luther King said, the law is wrong. I'm going to resist it. No. Of course, Martin Luther King didn't live in Rousseau's ideal society, and Rousseau would point that out, say, well, wasn't my ideal society was one of total equals, and of course, it's hardly the case at the time. So, it's not exactly a criticism of what he did, but if Martin Luther King lived in Rousseau's society and he would still want to resist, then he would have no standing. That's not possible. You cannot object to the law, because when you're objecting to the law, again, you're saying, I have an idea about what's right, and it's superior to what the law is saying. And that's anarchy, right? Where you're saying, I know what's right, and I'm going to stick to it. So the whole idea about getting out of anarchy is subjecting yourself to authority. So if you're going to subject, you subject. That's his basic idea. All right, so there's three parts to this. First, an idea about freedom. And he says the idea about freedom is living by your own will, and only by your own will. Or we'll see, for him that really means your rational convictions. Will become clearer later on. Second, the law in his type of society represents your will, your rational convictions. Because, A, it is self-imposed. You impose the law on yourself. It's not done by somebody else. And B, this law is based on the general will. All that will make sense. Like these steps, we're going to take one by one as we move on. And then the third is democratic decision-making, and democratic decision-making alone guarantees that laws are self-imposed and based on the general will. And so democratic decision-making means that the law represents your will, and if you live by your will, you'll be free. Right? So you can see how this argument adds up. So if you really live in a true democracy, he says, you will be free. By you substitute these parts. All right? It's not much of an explanation. It's more like a map. But that's what we're going to go. All right. So before we get to that, just to draw your attention to a point where you see the idea of self-determination really clear. So society as a collective freely setting its own rules as a whole Rousseau writes, at once, in place of individual personality of each, right, contracting party, that would be you and me, this act of association, that would be the creation of a society but through the social contract, creates a moral and collective body, society, composed of as many members as the assembly contains votes. Right? So as many people, so everybody who lives there has a vote. And receiving from this act, the social contract, the giving up of your rights and the subjecting to the authority of the community, its unity, its common identity, its life and its will. Right? So these are some ringing terms. Life, the community has life, the community has will, it has an identity. So this public person, so we're not talking about you and me anymore, we're talking about the community, right? Or the country or the state, if you so formed by the union of all others, right? So, and then he starts talking about terms like the sovereign and so on. Well, he starts defining some terms. But here in the run-up you see, here he's talking about the collective being a thing that matters, that has its own standing, it has a will, it has an identity, and it's formed by everybody uniting together. And it's moral, right? It's a moral and collective body. All right. So that's where we're going. All right. The first part. It's an idea about freedom, right? So Rousseau says, remember, right? Here's the map. Freedom requires, here's an idea about freedom. Freedom requires living by your own will. The law represents your will. And why? Well, because of A and B. And then he says democratic decision-making guarantees A and B, and that's how the whole thing runs, right? So first things first, what is freedom for him? Well, so two parts, he thinks. It's a negative kind of freedom, or independence, and a positive kind of freedom, or autonomy. I'm trying to now explain to you as clearly as possible what I think the best way of making sense of this is, right? So like, Rousseau doesn't really talk much about autonomy, or negative freedom, or positive freedom, and so on. So this is me trying to use terms that I hope are maximally clear. Now, by negative freedom, I just mean it's like the absence of things, right? So freedom requires an absence of something, and that if once you have that absence, you'll be independent. What is that? For Rousseau, it basically means the absence of other people bossing you around. So you're free. To be free, it has to be the case that you're not beholden to someone. Or to be free, it has to be the case, for example, that no one is putting you in a jail cell. Right? If they do, your freedom is ruined because you're no longer negatively free. Yeah. To be free, you need the absence of that kind of a person throwing you in jail. But also, to be free, you need to be absent from living under a dictator who can just set the law and says women will not be allowed to, have positions in public office or something, no women judges. Well, then you're not independent, he thinks, because you don't have this negative freedom, because there is this person, this jerk dictator, right, who's telling you as a woman that you cannot be a judge. And so you're dependent. You depend on that person. If he maybe changes his will and you become a judge, now you can become a judge, but right now you're not. You're not independent, right? You need to depend on this person's goodwill. All right, well, take that away, right? Take the negative part away, the interference. Are you then free? No, there's still something more that it requires. And Rousseau thinks, what's that more? It's autonomy. You need to have something yourself as well. So freedom is not just the absence of external limits, other people bossing you around. It's also autonomy. It's also you really being in charge of your own will. So that's something you have to achieve. You have to work your way up. Like little children, for example, the 1-year-old, it's not that yet, right? So they're not fully developed in their will yet. Bees aren't autonomous, right? Like they're just sort of the smell of a flower, they follow the smell, right? They're not autonomous in planning their life or something. You, on the other hand, hopefully are autonomous, right? You have a plan about what you want to do. You have a will, and you're acting on that will. I hope you weren't forced to take this course. You took this course because it fit in some greater plan of yours, right? Which is to get through college or maybe learn about these topics and things. So you're acting on that by being here, and that's an autonomous action. just if you weren't forced to take it, like if you were forced to take it, the independence condition would be violated. So you weren't freely here, you'd be forced to be taken. But even if you weren't forced, but you were just some sort of robot-like bee-like thing that just sees international affairs, I got to take it, right? Like that, then you wouldn't have autonomously chosen it because you would be, that's not freedom, it's like robot-like behavior, right? But if you had a plan, then that's roughly the idea.
But you have to know that you're free in order to be fulfilled.
I'm not sure. Yeah. I don't know if it has to be the case. I would expect that most people who are free, at least in the sense of autonomous, that whatever autonomy gives you also gives you the capacity to realize that you are free or not. You definitely don't have to know that you're unfree in order to be unfree, right? So it could be that somebody's hiding behind the bushes with a gun, right, and says like, if you take one step to the left, I'll shoot you, right? And then you're unfree to go to the left, because if you do, you actually can't do it, right? You'll be dead before you do the left. But you never choose to go to the left, right? So you never find out. So in those cases, you wouldn't know it, but you'd still not be free. Whether the flip side is true, whether you have to actively be aware that you're free in order to be it, I'm not sure. But, I think most people who are free in the sense that Rousseau has in mind will realize that they are, because it's a pretty highly aware state of mind, you know. Yeah, sure.
So is a negative kind of freedom bad? Like, I couldn't really understand.
No, they're good, because you need both parts to be free, and freedom is ultimately what Rousseau thinks is the thing that matters the most. Man is born free, right? And that's going to talk about how can we recover that in a society. And so you need both, he thinks. You need to be negatively free. So it's not, I don't mean by negative that it's a bad kind, right? Just mean by negative like it refers to the absence of things. And absence of other people being in charge of you. But then positively, you need more than just the absence of other people being in charge of you. You need to be in charge of you, right? If other people aren't in charge of you and you're also not in charge of you, then nobody's in charge. Then like a bee, there's not really anything, right? Right. But you need to be there. Like there needs to be an actual autonomous, developed person upstairs who is making real choices and not just following wherever the smells are coming from. Or, right, as to give the example from the beginning, whatever like keeping up with the Joneses means. Right? That's for Rousseau. That's going to be a kind of. It's not really. You're not really choosing that. That's not really the real deal. So, I give that example because Rousseau himself had socialist leanings. So he has a book, right, called The Discourses on Inequality, and he thinks that once material inequality is introduced in society, we get these type of desires, temptations to keep up with the Joneses, and they're not. It's like a corruption of the soul for things. So it's not the real deal. All right. So on my interpretation, right, this is the argument basically, and the argument is going to be something like this: freedom, at least the kind of freedom that Rousseau cares about, this kind of freedom, right, is to be guided by your own will. Now, if your actions are determined by the unilateral choices of others, so if other people are deciding what you're doing without your consent or your agreement, it's unilaterally just saying, here is what you shall do, right, one way or another, then you're not guided by your own will. Therefore, if your actions are determined by the unilateral choices of others, you are not free. That's the idea of freedom of independence. Okay? And then here's the second part. If you are guided by your own will, then your actions are determined by your own reasoned convictions. Therefore, to be free is for your actions to be determined by only your own reasoned convictions. So it requires freedom as independence and autonomy. That's a more formal statement of what we just talked about. Right? Not somebody else being in charge, plus you yourself actually being in charge. Independence and autonomy. That's why he thinks freedom has these two components. So far, so good? Okay. All right. So that was the first step. What is freedom? Independence and autonomy. Not the biggest deal so far, but now we're starting to get a little more deeper waters. Here's why Rousseau thinks that life in a political society, a democracy, will actually give you that. Right? So he starts saying, what you lose by signing the social contract is your natural liberty. So in some ways, in a state of nature, in anarchy, you are freer, in one sense, than you are in political society, because you don't have the chains, right? Like the example that Chantal was using, you can murder someone. Right? There's no police. So there is a weak person, kick him. Right? There is a kind of liberty in that, right? That you have, but you lose that once you enter civil society by signing the social contract. But that liberty that's what Rousseau calls natural liberty, and an unlimited right to everything he tries and succeeds in getting, right? So do you have a right to kick you? Well, can you stop me, right? Okay, well, clearly Rousseau is not much impressed by that, right? He thinks what he gains, so when we give that up, when we go into society, the freedom and right to do whatever we can get away with. And if you're strong, that's a lot, and if you're not so strong, then you're screwed. Maybe if you're sleeping, you don't have a right to, right? You're vulnerable. But what you gain when you give that up, the natural liberty, is civil liberty. This is the good stuff, right? And the proprietorship of all he possesses. So, and like Anthony was saying, right? Like you have property in that society, but it's going to be a protected type of property. It's the property that the law assigns and protects you in. And he thinks that's more than whatever. That can be more than what you could defend yourself, right? You might not be a very physically strong person, and so in anarchy or a state of nature, you would not be able to keep hold of everything. But in civil society, the law backs you up, and so you could be weak and wealthy, or strong and poor. Strong and wealthy, weak and poor, everything is possible as the law decides. And so there's a kind of freedom that you lose by going into society, but there is a better type of freedom that you get back, right? Civil liberty. So, all right. So what, right? Well, then this means, right, that the civil liberty, whatever it is that life in society gives you, is independent and autonomous. Right? That was the two elements of freedom that we saw before. So we get a radical idea of freedom. In a free society, we're independent because no one else can unilaterally determine your actions. Nobody will tell you what to do anymore. There's no bosses. There's no king. Right? And in a free society, this is even more outlandish, if you will, but maybe it's true. We're all autonomous. In that society, your own will determine. You will have a true will. You won't be a person who's moved by temptations, smells, peer pressure, these type of things, right? That are not really your real true will, but you will only be that. Okay. So the law will reflect that. So only that type of society will have that. All right. So all right, you can read this later. We're falling behind anyway. We've talked about this already. But anyway, he's saying, right, this is the task, right? He's saying, I'm looking for a form of association in which each, while uniting himself with all, may still obey himself alone. So the law tells you what to do, and yet you still obey yourself alone. And remain as free as before. So even though you give up your natural liberty, there is a type of freedom that you don't lose, even though you are in chains. Right? That's the paradox part. You might think, well, if I'm going to say I'm going to be fully free, isn't that anarchism? Aha, no, right? Because you're misunderstanding freedom. Freedom has this autonomy part, this independence part. All right. So, all right. Why would the social contract give you independence? So, going down the steps, right? What's freedom, independence, and autonomy? Rousseau is saying, in a political society that follows the social contract, you will be free, so he must think that you're both independent and autonomous. All right, step one. Why does the social contract guarantee your independence? This has to do with that rights surrendering. This is, in some way, maybe the most obscure part. Maybe not the most implausible part, but it's definitely the most obscure part. Here's the steps in the argument. So I'm going to just try and lay it out step by step. Everybody has to abandon all the rights to the community, right? Like full surrender. So that nobody can be in charge anymore. Right? So why? Okay, well, if everyone abandons all rights, then no individual person, no single person, right, has the standing to unilaterally insist that others do this or that, or just unilaterally determine their actions. Right? That's why I meant earlier, right? We say, well, the American founding thinks of us as people who will keep our rights in our back pockets, right, as we become citizens. So I enter society, but some rights that I have are inalienable, and if the government violates those rights, well, then guess what? The government is wrong. Right? And I can insist on my rights and hold the government to account. That's the idea. Sounds great? Sounds great. Well, not so great, says Rousseau, because if you do that, then you can say as an individual person, hey, wait, the government is violating my rights. Wrong. I will not obey this law. I will not play ball with the collective. I will not go along. What's wrong with that? Well, now what we're doing is there's this individual, me, right, who is unilaterally by myself. I'm saying, no, you don't get to do this. You don't get to take my money, or you don't get to put this law, this rule on me. And when I do that, I'm binding you, the rest of me, right, the rest of society. If I have standing, the founding document is saying I have the right to do this. Now that standing document is empowering me and is saying, actually, you get to call all proceedings to a halt because your rights have been violated. No, can't have that. So the flip side of that is if you don't have that, if nobody gets to do that, then there's no individual person who can tell other people how they have to live together. Right? The community decides something, and I have to say, okay, I guess that's it. Then I don't have the power to tell all of you how to live, because I have to accept it. Now, okay, that's just me, right? But now everybody doesn't have that power. So he says nobody has that power. Nobody has the standing to tell people how things ought to be organized. And that means that everybody's independent, because there's nobody to whom they're beholden. There's nobody in charge. I don't know about you. I always feel something. I can't put my finger on it, but I always feel something. I have a feeling of sleight of hand going on here. Something fishy about this claim. I can't quite put my finger on it, but. Anyway, so that's the first claim, right? If everyone abandons their rights, no one has the standing. Now, legitimate and self-determining society is based on the social contract, which involves, that's the one clause to which we can boil it down, right? The total alienation of each associate with together, all right? So then it follows, right? Just 1 and 2 together. Third claim follows logically that in a legitimate and self-determining society, no individual person has the standing to unilaterally determine the actions of others, right? That's just the 1 and 2 together. Okay? Is anyone not quite on board so far? Or is it? Yeah, Joe.
So if everyone is independent and autonomous, then who enforces, or how do you make sure nobody's rights are violated by other people? Right?
Good,
If
good.
no one can tell you what to do.
Yeah. All right, let me ask others. So if everyone is independent and nobody can tell you what to do, how do we make sure that no one's rights are violated?
Right.
Anyone have any ideas what Rousseau might say? So the law says, here are your rights, right? Like the stuff that your clothes that you wear are yours.
Right.
So here I come along and I snatch the head of your head, right? You say rights violation, right? And so your question is like, who's going to protect you against me?
Right, because in this, it would only I could protect
Right.
myself against other people. You know what I mean?
Right, that's the state of nature, so
Right.
we haven't really progressed much, right?
Yeah.
Sydney?
So I get this weird feeling of like brainwash from this whole idea. It's pretty much saying, you know, your natural rights are all gone if you accept this. And in a perfect world, if his stuff all works, it's saying that we give up everything we were born to be, you know, killing, eating, all that stuff. We give those rights up. We say we don't believe, we don't follow that. We're now going to follow this set of rights that entitles all of us to something. And this can only happen if everyone sticks to those rights, which if we do, we won't have to worry about anyone taking control of us or anyone demanding something of us, because we all stick to the path that we agreed to when we entered that society. Because as humans were not born to be a society. So if we want to be in society, we have to give up the rights that we were born to have.
Good. Yeah, so I guess Rousseau would say that ultimately if society works perfectly, then everybody, I'm not sure. He says the laws would reflect your true and autonomous will. So when you are in doing the democratic thing, like deliberating and deciding, then you would not want to resist a particular law. But maybe on a weak moment later in the week or something, you could like lapse, right? And then say, I love that hat so much, I'll snatch it. Right? I mean, presumably, I think the answer is going to be fairly simple, which is the police is going to do it, right? But then, who's the police? Well, the community will presumably create and appoint a police to act in its behalf. And what the police can do is only that which the community will allow the police to do. So something like that. And so the people who are the police, are they our bosses? No, because they're appointed by us, the community. They only do those things that we tell them and allow them to do. Their powers. And if they overstep them, well, guess what? They will be held to account too.
But just what I'm thinking is, but then it kind of seems like this could only work if everyone, like they come up with, okay, you're not allowed to do these certain things, right? And if you do them, then this point of
no hat stealing.
Right, no hat stealing.
Right.
Or the cops will come tell you to stop or put you in jail. You know what I mean?
Right. And then return the hat to you?
Right, yeah, I get my hat back. And
so then your rights are protected, he'd say.
Sure, yeah.
But it's not because there is some king above us that tells you, here's your hat, and as long as I feel like it, you can be protected in it. But it's because the whole community, you'll have the force of everybody behind you, is what he thinks.
It just seems like this is all really subject to the natural kind of corruption that we impose on all of our systems, whatever they be. You know what I mean? It's really vulnerable.
Yeah, there's no checks and balances, right?
Yeah.
Rousseau and the American system are diametrically opposed.
Right, I understand that.
So the checks and balances system in the American system is supposed to cause all sorts of problems and barriers for people to exercise their power. He wants it just to be direct self-governance, right? So maybe those things become necessary once we start appointing people and we're not really literally governing ourselves anymore. But if we are really governing ourselves, then there can be no things in place, because who's going to put those barriers in place? The founders? Well, those were just a couple of people. That was not everybody together, right? And it has to be everybody together, or otherwise we're just subject to what those founders thought. Maybe it was a good idea, or maybe not, but we're still subject to them. We have to follow their will. And that's not independence, right? For Rousseau, anyway. Hold on. I'm not sure if I addressed your concern, Sydney, did I? Okay. All right. Anthony?
It kind of goes along with what you were saying. Like, whenever you give up your rights, things like there's still a lot of things that we can't do because we gave up our rights to do certain things. Like, you can't go live anywhere you want in nature.
Right.
Like,
yes. Very important.
Property are cut off. Like, you can't. It's called squatting now. And you have to pay for property. So you don't have a right just to live anywhere you want. You can't keep a deer. It's illegal to keep animals. That's something you probably could have done back then. Like, you found an animal and you fed it and you could have kept it.
Right.
There's a lot of things that you can't do because you gave up your rights.
Very good point. You can't do anything. You can't go live off by yourself anymore. So in the 19th century, Henry David Thoreau wants to go live on Lake Walden and doesn't want anything to do with civil society anymore. Doesn't want to pay taxes because he's not using the roads. He's not going into town anymore. He's just self-sufficient. And they threw him in jail. He said, no, you got to pay your taxes, whether you like it or not. He said, I don't want to just be by myself. No. And Rousseau thinks that's the right thing to do. Right? So, now, Rousseau also thinks, this is maybe the more controversial part, not only when we force you in society, we're forcing you to be free, right? We're not just forcing you to be independent, by making sure that nobody is a boss anymore because everyone has an equal vote. We're also forcing you to be autonomous, right? So you'll live a better life, he thinks, a freer life yourself. The argument for that we'll see later. But all right, let me finish this. There's two more claims here, and then we'll stop. So this is the idea about independence, right? That a self-determining society that's democratic, no individual particular person will have the standing, the right to determine things. Now, this is a little unstated. There is a couple of turns of phrase where he says it as well. We also think, this is Jeff's point, right? So no individual person will have the physical ability to force other people to live by their will, because nobody will be strong enough to just fight off the entire police force of the society. And then it follows, and then this type of legitimate and self-determined, a democratic society, no individual person has either the standing or the ability to unilaterally determine the actions of others. And so then you get it, right? The freedom of independence is guaranteed by the social contract. And it's guaranteed because we're all equally subject to its terms. Is there a kind of brainwashing going on? Maybe. The argument that Rousseau gives for why he thinks you would be even freer, live a better life in society than if you wanted to just live by yourself, that has to do with why he thinks the social contract will also give you your autonomy. You'll act on a better part of yourself. So maybe that's brainwashing. Maybe that's just the stuff that was sort of buried in there and we're finally letting it out. But anyway, we'll see that next time. So see you on Tuesday.